For nearly 100 years, millions of children dreamed of playing in the World Cup, knowing their country would probably never get there. Then, in one historic decision, football's most exclusive tournament became its most inclusive. Some celebrated a new era. Others believed the World Cup would never be the same again. So, what really happened behind the biggest change in football history? The sun beats down on a dusty patch of red earth in sub-Saharan Africa, where the goalposts are nothing more than two discarded stones. Thousands of miles away, in a narrow, steep alleyway in South America, a taped-up ball ricochets off peeling concrete walls. On a makeshift court tucked between towering high-rises in Asia and across a sprawling green park in the American Midwest, the scene plays out exactly the same. The languages are different, the climates are different, but the children running until their lungs burn are all chasing the exact same phantom. They are playing in the World Cup. None of them know each other, yet they are all chasing the exact same impossible dream. A dream powerful enough to erase borders, languages, and every difference between them. In their minds, the crowd is deafening, the stakes are absolute, and the world is watching. But for decades, the brutal reality of international football meant that for most of these children, the dream was over before they ever took their first touch. The World Cup has always been the ultimate symbol of global unity, a rare month where the entire planet stops to speak a single language. Yet, beneath that romantic image lay a harsh mathematical truth. It was an incredibly selective club, a fortress with high walls and very few gates. For generations, the vast majority of the world's nations were locked outside, watching the same traditional powers pass the trophy back and forth. The question that now hangs over the future of the sport is as complex as the game itself. Did tearing down those walls and expanding the tournament destroy the very magic that made it special? Or did it finally allow the World Cup to live up to its name, representing the entire world? To understand the magnitude of what is about to happen, we must first go back to a time when football's greatest stage belonged to almost no one. In the winter of 1930, the world was a vast, disconnected place. When the first World Cup was held in Montevideo, Uruguay, there were no global television broadcasts. There were no billion-dollar sponsorship deals. There was only a profound sense of isolation and the daunting reality of geography. Only 13 nations competed in that inaugural tournament. The rest of the world wasn't eliminated. It simply never received an invitation. For billions of people, the greatest stage in football existed only as something to watch, never something they could truly reach. For the European teams, France, Belgium, Romania, and Yugoslavia, simply arriving at the pitch required a grueling, 3-week voyage across the Atlantic Ocean on a luxury liner called the Conte Verde. For the next half-century, the tournament remained deliberately small. 16 teams. That was the magic number. Out of the hundreds of nations and territories scattered across the globe, only 16 were granted an invitation to the grandest ball on earth. This extreme limitation was born out of logistical necessity, but over time, it forged the tournament's defining characteristic: exclusivity. The World Cup was not something you simply participated in. It was something you had to survive a brutal, multi-year war of attrition just to reach. Entire generations of brilliant footballers lived and died without ever hearing their national anthem played on a World Cup pitch. This scarcity created an aura of immense prestige. Because so few could enter, every single match felt like a heavyweight title fight. The tournament was a gathering of the absolute elite, a concentrated distillation of the world's greatest talent. To qualify was to achieve sporting immortality. To fail was to endure a national tragedy. The World Cup was beautiful because it was cruel. Every place had to be earned, and every dream could disappear in a single match. But while the tournament remained frozen in its traditional format, the world outside the stadiums was spinning faster than anyone could have predicted. Following the Second World War, The map of the world was entirely redrawn. Decolonization swept across Africa and Asia. Dozens of new nations were born, and with their independence came a fierce desire to assert their identity on the global stage. Football was the cheapest, most universal way to do that. The sport exploded. Millions of new fans poured into stadiums in cities that European executives had never even heard of. Grassroots programs sprouted in the Caribbean, across the Middle East, and deep within the Asian continent. Yet, the doors to the World Cup remained firmly shut. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, entire continents were forced to fight over a single qualifying spot. In 1966, the African nations famously boycotted the tournament entirely, outraged that they were expected to play off against Asian and Oceanic countries just to secure one solitary ticket to England. The math was fundamentally broken. The world of football had grown exponentially, but the World Cup was still operating as if it were an intimate European and South American dinner party. Heartbreak became the defining narrative for the developing football world. Historic records are littered with the stories of brilliant national teams from emerging regions who missed out on qualification by a single goal, a single point, or a single controversial refereeing decision. They possessed the talent, the passion, and the tactical discipline. But there simply weren't enough cheers when the music stopped. The World Cup was no longer reflecting the global reality of the sport. The pressure from these marginalized federations began to build, a slow, unstoppable tectonic shift that would eventually reach the polished corridors of power. In January 2017, inside a sterile, climate-controlled boardroom in Zurich, Switzerland, the tension was palpable. The men in tailored suits sitting around the table were not just discussing a sporting tournament. They were negotiating the geopolitical future of the world's most lucrative cultural asset. The proposal on the table was radical: expand the World Cup from 32 teams to 48. The debate that unfolded behind those closed doors was fiercely complex. It was a collision of history, economics, and politics. Those championing the expansion argued with passionate conviction. They spoke of inclusion. They pointed to the massive, untapped populations in Asia and Africa. They argued that giving smaller nations a realistic chance to qualify would trigger a tidal wave of government investment in youth academies, infrastructure, and coaching. They framed the 48-team World Cup as a moral imperative. But what if both sides were right? What if expanding the tournament could make football more global, while also making its greatest prize less exclusive? A necessary democratization of a sport that belonged to everyone. The critics in the room saw a very different motive. They pointed to the staggering financial projections. More teams meant more matches. More matches meant more broadcasting rights, more ticket sales, and more corporate sponsorships. They argued that the expansion was a thinly veiled cash grab that would fatally dilute the quality of the tournament. They warned of meaningless group stage matches, exhausted players, and a logistical nightmare that would strip the World Cup of its elite, razor-sharp competitive edge. But the momentum of history and the allure of unprecedented revenue could not be stopped. When the final vote was cast, the decision was unanimous. In a matter of minutes, nearly a century of carefully guarded tradition was erased. The doors were blown off their hinges. The 48-team World Cup was born. In that single moment, football's most exclusive tournament became its most ambitious. But as the executives shook hands and faced the flashing cameras of the global press, a daunting reality set in. Approving the biggest change in football history was merely a stroke of a pen. Actually building it would require moving mountains. The sheer scale of a 48-team tournament defies comprehension. Every single aspect of the World Cup had to be violently redesigned. The traditional 32-team format, a perfectly balanced mathematical equation of 8 groups of 4, was thrown out the window. The calendar had to be stretched. The number of matches skyrocketed to over 100. No single nation could easily absorb this kind of invasion. The infrastructure required to host 48 massive delegations, complete with their training staffs, media contingents, and hundreds of thousands of traveling fans, was unprecedented. It demanded more stadiums, more hotels, more training pitches, and more security than any single government could reasonably provide. The tournament had to evolve from a national celebration into a continental migration. It required multiple countries sharing the burden, spanning different time zones, climates, and cultures. The logistics of broadcasting, refereeing, and transporting teams across thousands of miles became a puzzle of staggering complexity. The World Cup was no longer just growing in size. It was fundamentally changing its state of matter. It was becoming an industrial behemoth. Yet, as architects drafted blueprints for billion-dollar stadiums and television networks mapped out global broadcast schedules, the true profoundness of the change was quietly taking root far away from the concrete and steel. The greatest transformation was happening inside the human mind. The announcement of the expansion triggered one of the most vicious and passionate debates in the history of sports. Football is a game deeply anchored in nostalgia. Fans are fiercely protective of their memories. For the purists, the World Cup is sacred precisely because it is ruthless. They argued that true glory requires the genuine threat of failure. If almost everyone can qualify, they asked, what is the value of qualification? They feared a tournament bloated with mismatched opponents, where the dramatic tension of the group stages would evaporate into a series of predictable, lopsided exhibitions. On the other side of the divide stood the progressives, who saw the purists' arguments as the ultimate expression of privilege. How easy it is to defend exclusivity, they countered, when your country qualifies every 4 years. They argued that the soul of the World Cup is not found in the tactical perfection of a semi-final between two European giants. The soul of the World Cup is found in the tears of a nation hearing its anthem on the global stage for the very first time. The football world fractured along these ideological lines. Former legends, tactical analysts, and everyday supporters argued endlessly in television studios and local pubs and across the internet. Was the tournament sacrificing its prestige for profit? Or was it finally breaking free from an elitist past? The noise was deafening. But while the experts debated the philosophical purity of the sport, millions of children simply laced up their boots and went back to the dirt pitches, the narrow alleys, and the concrete courts. Only this time, something fundamental had shifted. For the first time, a child growing up in a nation that had spent decades watching from the outside could look at the World Cup and believe that the impossible had become merely difficult. For the first time in their lives, the dream was no longer a phantom. The brutal mathematics of qualification had changed. For historically excluded nations in Africa, Asia, and Central America, the path to the World Cup was suddenly visible. It was still incredibly difficult, but it was no longer impossible. This psychological shift sent shockwaves through the developing football world. Governments that had previously ignored the sport suddenly realized that a World Cup appearance was within reach. One qualification could transform an entire generation, filling stadiums, inspiring children, attracting investment, and giving a nation a moment of pride that would outlive the tournament itself. Funding began to flow. Grassroots academies were established in regions that had never seen a manicured pitch. National federations hired better coaches, implemented modern sports science, and began scouting their diasporas with renewed desperation. The promise of a single, attainable ticket to the World Cup proved powerful enough to alter the trajectory of entire nations. Players who would have previously abandoned the sport to find traditional work now had a reason to keep pushing, to keep training in the dark, to keep believing. They understood that if they could just survive the qualifiers, they could change the history of their homeland forever. Perhaps this is the true legacy of the expansion. It is not about the trophy. It is not about the broadcasting revenue or the political posturing in Swiss boardrooms. It is about the sheer, undeniable power of hope. A single World Cup appearance can inspire a generation of children to believe that they are not invisible. It can validate their existence on the world stage. The 48-team World Cup may never look exactly like the tournaments that came before it, but for millions of children around the world, it has already done something extraordinary. It has made the impossible feel possible. And that brings us to the ultimate, unanswerable question. History is a relentless judge, but it is rarely a swift one. Every major evolution of the World Cup was initially met with fierce resistance. When the tournament expanded to 24 teams in 1982, critics claimed the quality would plummet. Instead, it gave us unforgettable underdog stories. When it expanded to 32 teams in 1998, traditionalists warned that the magic was dead. Instead, it birthed a modern golden era of the sport, creating memories that are now universally cherished. Each generation believes that their version of the World Cup is the definitive one. Each generation is convinced that any alteration is a desecration of the sacred text. Yet, each generation ultimately falls in love with the new heroes, the new dramas, and the new miracles that inevitably unfold on the grass. 50 years from now, a 48-team World Cup might seem completely normal. Future fans might look back at the 32-team era and wonder how the sport ever survived being so small, so restricted, so blind to the vast talent scattered across the globe. Or, perhaps, history will view this moment differently. Perhaps this will be remembered as the breaking point, the moment the balloon was inflated just a little too far, sacrificing the soul of the game on the altar of endless growth. Only time possesses that answer. The most monumental shifts in human history rarely feel historic in the chaotic, noisy moments of their inception. They only reveal their true shape in the quiet reflection of the future. The heavy, iron doors of football's most exclusive club have finally been pushed open. For nearly a century, millions stood outside in the cold, pressing their faces against the glass, dreaming of an opportunity that geography and mathematics dictated would never arrive. Now, the threshold has been crossed. There is no denying that something intangible has been lost. The ruthless, terrifying exclusivity that defined the World Cup for generations is gone. But in its place, the tournament has found a truer, more honest reflection of the planet it claims to represent. It is no longer a curated exhibition of the elite. It is a messy, sprawling, chaotic celebration of the entire world. Regardless of where you stand on the debate, one absolute truth remains. The history of the World Cup has been irreversibly rewritten. Whether history remembers the 48-team World Cup as football's greatest evolution or its boldest gamble, one thing is already certain: the game will never be the same again. The same children who opened this story are still kicking worn-out balls across dusty fields and narrow streets. The difference is that today, for many of them, the door no longer feels permanently locked. The pages of the past belong to the traditional giants, the familiar names etched in silver and gold. But the blank pages of the future will be written by nations that, until a few years ago, never dared to imagine they would even be allowed to hold the pen. The true impact of this decision does not live in the record books of today. It belongs entirely to the unwritten future. Every World Cup champion once walked through a door that someone else opened before them. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the 48-team World Cup will be opening that door for someone entirely new. If your country had one chance to make history at the World Cup, what would that moment look like? Tell us in the comments. Do you believe the 48-team World Cup will create football's greatest underdog story? Or should the tournament have stayed exactly as it was?